Shadow Creek Valley didn't welcome Nate Callahan back. It warned him. 30 years ago, he left this Montana slice of earth with a uniform, a duffel bag, and a promise to return soon. Soon became decades. Now, at 65, he rolled in on a dying Ford, heater dead, knuckles white, a man who survived war but never outran what he'd abandoned. The ranch waited at the end of a frozen track. Burnt walls, a collapsed barn, and black ribs of timber under snow. Locals whispered it was cursed. Nate shut off the engine and felt a silence heavier than any battlefield. Sarge, his wolf-gray retired service dog, pressed close, nose tasting the wind. Before sunrise, the dog yanked the leash and dragged Nate downhill toward Box Canyon. Sarge had never pulled like that, not even overseas. This wasn't fear, it was a mission. They cut through frost-stiff brush until the world narrowed into stone. A fresh landslide sealed a slit in the cliff. From inside came a faint scrape, then a breath. Thin, animal, impossible. Nate squeezed through a gap barely wider than his shoulders. A horse stood in a pocket of rock like a prisoner left to rot. Muddy bay hide stretched over ribs, hooves twisted into spirals, breath stumbling in white clouds. Yet it was standing, watching. Those eyes weren't terrified, they were familiar. The same fire Nate carried since combat. Ashes. The Mustang from his childhood. The one that vanished the year he shipped out. Stone groaned behind him. The canyon shifted, a boulder inching toward the opening he'd crawled through. If it were sealed, he'd be trapped with a dying horse in a Montana freezer. If he ran now, the horse would die for sure. Nate came back to bury a past. Instead, his dog had found something that could drag it into the light, or kill them both before morning. Nate Callahan rolled into Shadow Creek Valley as if he were crossing a border that had been erased from every map except his own. The Ford's engine clattered on the climbs, a tired animal refusing to quit. The heater quit 2 towns back, so the cab was a refrigerator of steel and dust. Each breath turned white before his eyes. His hands ached on the wheel. His lower back flared with every rut, the kind of pain that makes you bite down and keep moving because stopping hurts worse. The valley tightened around him. Pines stood thick and dark, their needles glazed with frost. November had locked the ground early. The road was frozen ruts and slick shadow. Wind slid down Box Canyon and slapped the truck sideways, making the door shudder. Nate eased off the gas. He hadn't seen this place in 30 years, yet his body remembered every bend. He stopped at the general store because the Ford was coughing, and he needed supplies before night. The building looked the same. Tin siding, low roof, one fogged window glowing warm. Pickup trucks idled by the pumps, exhaust hanging low. When Nate climbed out, cold hit his face like a fist. His knees complained. Sarge, wolf gray and white, 10 years old and retired from service, hopped down and stood close, scanning the lot. Inside, a bell rang overhead. Heat and the smell of propane, jerky and wet wool wrapped around Nate. Voices dropped to a hush. 3 men by the coffee counter stared. A woman at the register paused mid-scan. Their eyes moved from Nate's weathered face to the dog and back again, weighing him like a rumor that had walked in wearing boots. "Morning," Nate said. No answer, just a long second of silence. Then an older man in a red cap muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." Nate took a cart and moved through the aisles with practiced economy. Feed, beans, coffee, aspirin, a roll of tarp, matches, and a few basic tools. He didn't browse, he gathered. The stairs followed him anyway. Shadow Creek forgave outsiders faster than it forgave the ones who left. At the counter, the woman rang him up without small talk. Nate slid bills across. She hesitated before taking them. "You're Nate Callahan," she said finally. He nodded. "Yes, ma'am." The door opened again, throwing a gust of sharp air into the store. Garrett Vance stepped in, wrapped in a dark shearling coat that looked too clean for this valley. He spotted Nate and smiled like he'd been waiting. "Well, look who crawled home," Vance said. "Nathan Callahan. Thought the army kept you or the city did." "Still here," Nate replied. Vance's gaze swept Nate's cart, then his truck keys. "Heard you came back to check on the old place." "Shame. Been sitting like a burnt-out campfire since your folks passed. You don't need that burden." "I didn't come to talk about it," Nate said. "But we should." Vance leaned an elbow on the counter. "I've watched that property rot for years. Taxes, liability. I'll take it off your hands today, clean and simple." "I'm not selling," Vance chuckled. "There's nothing left but charcoal and ghosts. I'll give you a fair number." "Fair to whom?" "Cash right now, 5,000. The store went so quiet. Nate could hear the coffee machine gurgle. 5,000 wouldn't buy the lumber for a new porch. Vance said it like a rescue. "That land is worth more than your pocket change," Nate said. "And it's mine." Vance's smile thinned. "Worth is what the market says. No house, no barn, fences down, water rights you can't prove. The county could condemn it any winter. Are you going to fight a Montana winter alone?" Sarge shifted, a low rumble in his chest. Nate gave a small two-finger signal. The dog quieted, but his stare stayed locked on Vance. "I can stand," Nate said, "and I can say no." Vance studied him, then laughed. "All right, keep your ruins. But don't expect this valley to applaud. Folks moved on. You can't rebuild on memories. I'm not asking for applause." Vance shrugged. "The offer won't get better after you freeze in that truck." He flicked his gaze to Sarge, then walked out. The woman pushed Nate's bags toward him. "A storm's rolling in tonight, a bad one." "Thanks," Nate said. He lifted the feed with a grunt and headed out. Outside, clouds stacked over the ridge. Wind had teeth now. He loaded the Ford, paused with hands on the tailgate, and breathed through the ache. Sarge nudged his thigh, steadying him. The track to the ranch was rougher than he remembered. Pine branches arched overhead, heavy with ice. The black rib cage of the old barn rose from the snow. Another bend, and the house ruins appeared. Half-buried, charred logs jutting like bones. The place felt smaller than his boyhood, but the air still carried sage and wood smoke. He parked where the porch used to be. The engine shivered and fell silent. Nate stepped out into a hush that felt alive, with only wind threading through wreckage. Sarge trotted the foundation, sniffing, reading the past in scents Nate couldn't see. Nate walked the property slowly. The well cap was gone. Fences lay flat under drifts. The root cellar doors were crusted with ice. He found the apple tree stump and rested a hand on it like touching a gravestone. He circled the ruin once more, boots crunching, letting landmarks line up with old memories. The creek bed was choked with ice, and the pasture where his mother once hung laundry had turned to sage and snow. Somewhere beyond the trees a coyote yipped, then went quiet. Nate felt the valley watching, daring him to quit. He checked the gas gauge, still hugging empty, stacked firewood scraps he'd found, and pushed a board across the truck bed for a windbreak. "One night," he told himself, "then we plan." But the words sounded like another excuse to leave. He looked at Sarge, at the dog's steady eyes, and corrected it aloud. "We're staying. This is home again." By late afternoon, the sky went leaden. He knew better than to drive again until morning. The Ford might not start twice. So he spread the tarp in the truck bed, laid out blankets with soldier-neat care, and set his duffel beside the tailgate. Dinner was beans straight from the can. He gave Sarge jerky, then drank coffee that tasted like rust. Darkness fell fast. Wind prowled through the ruins, moaning along broken beams. Nate lay in the truck bed, staring at a slice of stars. Sarge curled against his legs, solid heat and steady breath. Nate thought of Vance's offer, of the eyes in the store, of the years he hadn't come home. He could sell, find a trailer somewhere warmer, or wait out whatever life he had left. It would be easy. Easy had already taken too much. He turned, hand resting on Sarge's shoulder. "We're staying," he whispered. "This place doesn't get sold, not to him, not to anybody." Sarge lifted his head, eyes catching moonlight, then pressed, his muzzle into Nate's palm. Outside, the first fine snow began to fall. Morning arrived like a blade. The November cold hadn't eased. It sat on Shadow Creek Valley with the weight of iron. Nate Callahan woke in the bed of his Ford truck to frost on the tarp and pain in his back that made him wince before he even sat up. The heater had died yesterday, and the night had been a slow lesson in how small a man feels with nothing but thin blankets and a loyal dog between himself and the Montana dark. Sarge was awake too, head high, ears aimed toward the trees. Wolf gray and white, 10 years old, and retired from service, he still carried that alert posture Nate had trusted overseas. Nate rubbed his hands together, breathed on his fingers, and climbed down. The ranch around him was a black skeleton. Charred beams, snow-filled rooms, and old collapsed barn that groaned when the wind moved through it. He tried not to stare long. Memory could freeze a person faster than weather. He cracked open a can of beans, ate a few mouthfuls, then poured the rest into Sarge's bowl. The dog sniffed once and turned away. Nate frowned. Sarge never skipped food unless something was wrong. "What's up, boy?" Nate said. Sarge paced the edge of the clearing, nose working, tail tight. He gave a short bark, then trotted toward the pines and looked back hard. Nate clipped on the leash out of habit. Sarge surged forward so fast Nate staggered. "Easy!" Nate started, but the dog pulled again, stronger. Not fear, direction. Nate felt that old reflex rise. Follow the one who sees first. "All right," he said, bracing his bad back. "Lead." They headed downhill toward Box Canyon. The trail was stiff with crusted snow. Every step sent a spike through Nate's spine, but Sarge didn't slow. He towed Nate through dense pines into a corridor of rock that swallowed sound. The air got sharper there, trapped in shade. The creek was a hidden ribbon under ice, and the canyon felt like the inside of a freezer. Sarge jerked left off the main path. Nate saw it then. A fresh landslide, ugly and raw, a wall of boulders and snapped timber piled across the canyon floor. Snow dusted the rocks, but the wound was new enough to still smell of earth. Sarge dragged Nate to a narrow gap between two house-sized stones and shoved his muzzle inside, whining. A faint scrape came from within, then a breath. Nate dropped to his knees and peered through. At first, all he saw was shadow. Then he shape-shifted, and his stomach tightened. A horse stood trapped in a pocket behind the slide. It was a muddy bay Mustang, skin stretched over ribs, legs trembling under starvation. Its mane hung in filthy ropes. The hooves had grown into cruel spirals, twisted so badly the animal balanced on angles that screamed pain. Frost clung to its whiskers, yet it was standing, and its eyes were fixed on Nate with a hard, unbroken will. Nate's throat went dry. He knew that face. "Ashes," he whispered. The Mustang flicked an ear. Its nostrils flared, pulling in Nate's scent, but it didn't lunge or collapse. It only watched, as if weighing whether he was a rescuer or another end. Sarge crawled into the opening as far as he could, belly low, tail moving in careful sweeps. He gave a soft, steady whine, the same sound he'd used on injured men and on Nate during nightmares. Ashes tensed, then held still. Dog and horse stared at each other, two exhausted fighters unsure if the war was over. Nate eased forward until he was close enough to see dried blood around the hooves and scabs on the fetlocks. He had seen bodies worn down by hunger, and he knew the edge this horse was living on. A few more days in this canyon and the valley would finish the job. He found a thin seep of water running under a rock, half frozen. He cupped it in his palm and offered it. Ashes leaned in, lips quivering, then drank in quick, desperate pulls. When the horse lifted its head, a tremor ran through its whole frame. Nate swallowed hard. Ashes had been his father's pride, his boyhood companion, the colt that trusted only Nate to ride across the pasture. After the fire and the funerals, Ashes vanished. Nate had told himself the horse ran off or died. Seeing him here, alive and wrecked, felt like a door opening into a room Nate had spent 30 years sealing. He turned to study the slide. The boulders were massive. The gap he'd crawled through was barely wide enough for a man, never mind a horse. Freeing Ashes would take leverage, rope, time, and more strength than Nate felt he had left. Behind him, Sarge pressed his shoulder against Nate's leg, steady as an anchor. Nate's mind snapped back to yesterday in the store. Garrett Vance's grin, his offer of pennies for rotting land. If Nate sold, Vance would sweep in before the thaw. He would find this canyon, find the trapped Mustang. And a man like that wouldn't waste feed on a crippled horse. He'd call it mercy, then pull a trigger to clear his path. The image hit Nate like shrapnel. He felt anger flare hot beneath the cold. He had left this valley, left his parents waiting, and left his own life unfinished. But he would not leave again while something living depended on him. He looked at Ashes, at the ribbed chest rising and falling, at the eyes that still refused to bow. That endurance felt like a challenge. Nate stood, spine protesting, and rested a hand on the rock. "All right," he said, "we're not doing this halfway." Sarge let out a single bark, short and sure. Nate faced the canyon mouth, then the long trail back to the ruins, then the ridge where Vance's holdings began. The valley could sneer, the cold could threaten. Vance could wait with his money. None of that mattered more than the choice Nate was making right now. He would stay. He would not sell. He would fight the winter with ropes and levers and whatever stubbornness war had left in him. He would free Ashes, because saving this horse was the only way he knew to start paying a debt that had sat on his chest for 30 years. Nate knelt again, testing the rope at his waist, measuring angles like he used to measure bad ground. There was a way through. He mapped the rocks in his head, picking a first target, then a second. Each stone was an enemy position, each pull a step toward daylight for them both. Sarge moved back to Ash's side and leaned his body gently into the Mustang's trembling shoulder. Ashes flinched, then accepted the warmth. For a moment, the pocket behind the slide stopped feeling like a prison and started feeling like a small camp of survivors. Nate reached through the gap and touched Ash's neck, bone under hide, a pulse still stubbornly there. If you've ever felt something inside you wasn't finished fighting, stay with us, he whispered into the frost. Nate spent the walk back to the ruins planning like a sapper. The canyon needed water first, not heroics. A horse could survive hunger longer than thirst, and Ashes had already been without a decent drink for too long. The sheep he'd found was trapped behind that boulder like a vein pinched shut. If he could open the spring, he could keep the Mustang alive while he figured out the larger slide. He scavenged what the fire had spared. A length of frayed rope from the old tack room, still smelling faintly of smoke. 2 fence posts half buried in snow. A rusted pulley wheel he pulled from the barn wreckage. A pry bar with a bent jaw. He loaded them into a sled he made from a door panel, then hauled everything down the trail, each step a white-hot complaint from his back. Sarge ranged ahead, silent, checking shadows as if the pines might still hide snipers. At the canyon mouth, Nate laid the tools out on bare stone. He crouched, breathing through cold air, and studied the problem. The boulder blocking the spring was squat and ugly, maybe 400 pounds, wedged in the landslide's toe. It wasn't one rock, it was a lock holding several smaller stones behind it. If he tried to shove it straight, he'd lose. If he changed the angle and used leverage, he might win. He dug a shallow trench with a hatchet, clearing snow so the pry bar could bite. Then he jammed a fence post under the bar to make a long lever and planted the other post upright as a fulcrum, wedging it between 2 stable stones. The setup looked crude, but physics didn't care about beauty. Length became strength. Nate looped the rope around the boulder, ran it through the pulley, and anchored the far end around a pine root as thick as his wrist. He checked every knot twice, fingers stiffening numb. Sarge stood at the gap, body angled outward, ears flicking. Every so often he let out a low huff, a warning more than a sound. Nate trusted him the way he'd trusted radio chatter in a storm. If Sarge said something was moving, it was. "All right, partner," Nate muttered. "On my count, you keep watch. I'll do the dumb part." He set his boots wide, grabbed the lever, and put his weight into it. Pain speared his spine, and he nearly let go. He breathed, reset, and leaned again, slow and steady. The pry bar groaned. The fulcrum post dug deeper. The boulder didn't move. Nate let the lever rest, then pulled on the rope to change the load. He didn't yank. He drew it tight, then tightened again, making the rope sing. The pulley creaked, but the anchor held. He returned to the lever, pushed with a long exhale, and felt the rock give a hair's breadth. That tiny shift was a victory's first whisper. "Good," he said aloud, because his hands were shaking and he needed to hear the word. He pushed again. The boulder rocked, grinding against frozen grit. He used his hip and shoulder, not his back, like lifting a wounded buddy. It inched forward, then settled. He cursed under his breath, reset the fulcrum, and pulled rope slack through the pulley to keep pressure constant. Clouds slid over the sun, dimming the canyon. Wind funneled down the stone chute and tried to freeze the sweat on his neck. He ignored it. He pushed, paused, pulled, and pushed again, a rhythm as familiar as drills. The boulder shifted another inch, then 2. Smaller rocks behind it rattled free, tumbling into the trench. Sarge stiffened suddenly and stared upslope. Nate froze with the lever in his hands. A flurry of snow fell from a branch, nothing else. After a beat, Sarge relaxed, but stayed sharp. Nate returned to work, grateful for that borrowed calm. After 20 minutes, his arms quivered and his breath came in rough bursts. He drank a mouthful of icy water from his bottle, then put his weight in once more. This time, the boulder lurched, rolling a half-turn before the rope caught it. Nate almost fell. He dug in his heels, held the rope, and eased the stone forward until it rested clear of the spring's narrow channel. A thin ribbon of water immediately seeped out, dark and quick, cutting a line through frost. It wasn't much at first, but as pressure released, the flow strengthened, bubbling from beneath the shale like something waking. Nate laughed once, a sound he hadn't expected to have left. "Go on," he told Ashes. The Mustang stood in the pocket behind the slide, head low, ribs lifting. Nate guided the water with a shallow groove he carved using the pry bar's tip. It ran toward the gap in a narrow stream. Ashes sniffed, then stepped closer, hooves trembling. Sarge shifted to the side, giving space, yet ready to herd if the horse panicked. Ashes lowered his muzzle and drank. Not dainty sips, but long, greedy pulls that made his throat work hard. Water dripped from his whiskers and froze in tiny beads. His ears tipped back in relief, the hollow filled with the wet sound of survival. Nate watched until the horse slowed and lifted his head. For the first time in days, Ash's eyes softened a fraction. He blew a shaky breath and shook his mane, as if remembering he still lived. Nate sank onto a rock, chest rising, hands aching, back flaming. He was exhausted, but it was the good kind. The kind that came after a bridge was held or a patrol made it home. He glanced around the canyon, already seeing the next steps. Water meant time. Time meant options. Options meant no surrender. Sarge padded over and sat beside him, shoulder touching Nate's thigh. The dog's gaze swept the rim of the canyon, then returned to Nate, calm and proud. "Tiny win," Nate said, rubbing the dog's neck. "But a win." The wind howled again outside the pocket, but inside, spring water ran clear, and 3 battered soles held a line against the cold. He reached into his coat for a crushed packet of electrolytes he'd carried since the service, tore it with his teeth, and sprinkled the powder into a small pan. He set it where the stream pooled. "Not fancy," he told the horse, "but it'll help keep your legs from cramping." Ashes sniffed the pan, then drank again, slower now, learning that help could be steady. Nate used the lull to clear more rubble by hand, tossing fist-sized stones aside so the water wouldn't choke. Each lift hurt, yet he kept his movements measured, thinking of strength the way a mechanic thinks of fuel. Don't waste it. Spend it where it matters. He checked the rope, rewrapped the anchor, and left the lever in place for later. A raven passed overhead, croaking once, then disappearing into cloud. Nate watched it go and felt the canyon's cold loosen. He pushed the thought aside and focused on what was in front of him. A living horse, a loyal dog, and water running toward daylight. For the first time here, hope outweighed fear today. That afternoon the Chinook never came. The cold stayed nailed to the canyon walls, and Nate felt it in his knuckles as he climbed back toward the ranch with the door sled dragging behind him. The spring was flowing now, Ashes was drinking, and Sarge had settled into his watch like the last guard on a perimeter. It should have felt like progress. Instead, every step uphill pulled Nate deeper into a silence he didn't know how to answer. Smoke, black timbers, and half-melted nails greeted him at the homestead. He moved through the ruins the way a man walks a former barracks at night, careful, listening for ghosts. The concrete pad where the kitchen had been was slick with frost. He prized loose a warped board and checked the hollow beneath. His father had hidden things everywhere when Nate was a kid: tools, seed packets, and the good fishing lures. Nate told himself he was hunting for anything useful. The wind shifted, carrying a faint rattle from the collapsed tack shed. Nate followed it. The shed leaned into the earth, roof caved, a rib cage of charred beams. He ducked under a crosspiece and swept the snow aside with his boot. Something metal clinked. An old ammo can sat wedged between 2 stones, its olive paint blistered by heat, but its latch still intact. Nate's breath caught. He hadn't seen one of those since the service. His father had loved those boxes, waterproof and honest, he used to say. Nate brushed frost off the lid and saw a faint scratch on the side. NC. the same initials on Nate's dog tags. He eased the latch open. A dry, papery smell rose out. Not smoke, but cellar air. Inside lay a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. He unrolled it and found a small leather diary, edges darkened, cover warped, but unburned. A folded photo was tucked behind the first page. His parents in the pasture, his mother holding a young Ashes by a rope, his father's arm around her shoulders. Their faces were sun-worn, smiling in a way that made Nate's chest hurt. Sarge padded up behind him and sat quietly as if he already understood this was not a job for barking. Nate opened the diary. His father's handwriting slanted tight and steady, the same hand that had once guided a plow straight across stubborn ground. The first entries were from 1994. Repairs, early frost, a neighbor's calf-born breech, ordinary lines, safe lines. Nate read them like a thirsty man, then spring, 1995. "Nate hasn't written in 3 months, one line said. Peggy says the Army keeps them moving. I told her our boy will come when he can. He always keeps his word." Nate swallowed. He turned more pages. "Doctor in town says the cough is worse. Doris won't let me tell Nate. She thinks it will distract him. I think he deserves to know where home stands." Another. "Doris fills out the same postcard and doesn't send it. Says she's saving the words for when Nate arrives." His fingers tightened on the paper. April 12th, his father wrote. "War takes sons and gives back strangers. I pray ours comes back before we're ash." The handwriting grew shakier, margins filling with cramped notes. May 3rd, the hospice neighbor's nurse visited, says weeks, maybe less. Doris sat at the table and stared at the road until dark. She told me to keep the porch light on every night. "He'll see it from the bend," she said. "He'll know we're still waiting." Nate's throat closed. He hadn't come. He hadn't even called. He'd been training a new unit, telling himself there would be time after the next rotation. He forced himself to keep reading. June 17th. "Doris couldn't make it to the porch today. I carried her out in the chair anyway. She wanted to feel the wind. She asked me if Nate's truck might look different now. I told her I'd recognize it a mile away." July sat. No word. She keeps my old binoculars on her lap. Every dusk she lifts them toward the ridge. She whispers, "Maybe tomorrow." The last entry was dated August 9th, 1995. The letters were barely holding together. "If you find this, son, I'm gone. Your mother went last week at sunrise, eyes fixed on the road. She was sure you'd come. I told her you loved her." She smiled. "I'm writing in case guilt tries to follow you home like a wolf. Don't let it eat you alive. We waited because waiting was love. If you come back after we're dust, keep the land, keep the horse, keep your heart." Nate couldn't breathe. The diary blurred. He pressed the heel of his palm to his eyes, but the tears seeped through anyway. A sound came out of him that he'd buried for decades, rough and helpless. Sarge leaned into his side, pushing that steady, warm weight against Nate's ribs. The dog didn't whine or lick. He just stayed, a living brace. "I'm sorry," Nate whispered, though he didn't know who he was saying it to. "I'm sorry, Dad. I'm sorry, Mom." He slumped against a scorched post and let the sobs roll through him. He had cried once after a firefight overseas, silent tears wiped away before daylight. This was different. This was a dam breaking. In his mind he saw the porch light burning night after night, a small gold dot in a dark valley. He saw his mother in a chair, scarf at her chin, binoculars aimed toward the ridge. He saw his father splitting wood with a cough that bent him double, still believing a truck would turn that bend. Nate had not been there for any of it. The pages called it what it was. Absence. The guilt hit like a late mortar round. Not loud, not sudden, but crushing and total. He felt the years fold in on him, every missed call, every postponed visit, every excuse. He stared at the photo again, at his parents' smiles beside young Ashes. The horse in Box Canyon, starving and stubborn, was a thread to that past. Saving Ashes wasn't only rescue, it was a promise delayed, a way to do one thing right where he had done so many wrong. Nate wiped his face on his sleeve and pulled in a long, shaking breath. "All right," he said to the ruins, to whoever might still be listening. "You waited for me. I'm here now. I won't run again." Sarge thumped his tail once, soft on the snow. Nate slid the diary back into the ammo can, not to hide it, but to keep it safe from damp. He carried the can to the truck and set it on the passenger seat like a companion. Then he turned toward the canyon, shoulders squared despite the ache. The cold felt the same, but his purpose didn't. If you've ever carried guilt that eats you alive, you're going to need tissues for what's coming, he said quietly, not to an audience yet, but to himself. He clipped the leash to Sarge's collar, checked the rope, and started walking back down through the pines toward the horse that was now his penance. Nate almost turned around twice on the way to town. The road was slick, the ford sounded like a coffee can full of bolts, and every bump sent lightning through his lower spine. But Ash's twisted hooves kept flashing in his mind. The Mustang could drink now and stand for a little while, yet infection in those cork-screwed feet would kill him slow if Nate didn't act fast. By the time the general store appeared, gray in the snow haze, the sky had thickened with another hard wind. Sarge rode curled on the bench seat, eyes open, watching the tree line. Nate parked near the pumps, shut off the engine, and rested his forehead on the wheel for a breath before climbing out. Inside, the warmth hit him, followed by the same wary looks. Nate didn't browse. He went straight to the counter where the woman from yesterday sorted receipts. "I need a ride to Russo's," Nate said. Her eyebrows lifted. "Pawn shop?" Nate nodded. "And a farrier kit. Antibiotics, too, if he's got any." She studied him like she wanted to ask more, then said, "Russo opens in 10. Sheriff Holt's office is across the street if your truck dies." "It'll live long enough," Nate replied. No one offered help, but an older man in a red cap slid Nate a small cup of coffee without a word. Nate took it, drank, and felt his hands warm. Russo's place sat between a diner and a bait store, its window crowded with old guitars, chainsaws, and tarnished buckles. A bell clanged when Nate pushed inside. The air smelled of metal and dust. Russo himself stood behind the counter, thick mustache, sleeves rolled. "What can I do for you?" Russo asked. Nate set his left wrist on the glass. The Hamilton watch caught the light even under grime, the engraved back still sharp. 1985, U.S. Army Service, Callahan. He had worn it through deployments, funerals, and nights when time was the only thing he could control. "I need to pawn this," Nate said. Russo whistled low. "That's a memory. You sure?" "I don't have another option." Russo turned it over, checked the movement with a loupe. "Runs clean, worth more than most folks here know. How much you need?" $200 for antibiotics, $50 for hoof nippers, a farrier knife, vet wrap. Russo leaned back, then nodded. "I'll loan you $400, 30 days. You come back for it. I keep it safe." Nate exhaled. "Deal?" Russo wrote the ticket, slid the cash across, and placed the watch in a velvet tray behind him like it was sacred. Nate stared 1 second too long. "You're coming back for it," Russo said. "Yes," Nate answered. He bought supplies next. Broad-spectrum antibiotics from the feed store, a clean syringe, antiseptic, hoof nippers heavy enough to bite, and a rasp with teeth like a saw. The clerk eyed him, But Nate didn't explain. He added oats and a salt block, then headed out before the wind could turn meaner. The Ford protested the climb to Box Canyon, but it started, and that was enough. Nate parked near the trailhead and loaded the kit into the sled. Snow stung his cheeks. Sarge trotted beside him, slow this time, sensing the weight of what lay ahead. Ashes heard them before they reached the gap. The Mustang lifted his head, eyes widening, muscles tensing in a reflex older than any ranch. Nate spoke softly as he crawled through, keeping his body low and hands open. "Easy," Nate murmured. "We're going to help you." Sarge slid in first and sat close to Ash's shoulder, not blocking, just present. When the horse shifted back, Sarge leaned his full body against the Mustang's chest, in a steady pressure the way a trained dog does for panic. Ash's breathing slowed a notch. Nate set the antiseptic on a flat stone and warmed the syringe between his palms. He drew the dose, then approached the horse's neck. Ashes flinched, whites showing. "Stay with me," Nate said. Sarge pressed harder, head tucked, a living brace. Nate found the muscle, slid the needle in clean and pushed the plunger. Ashes jolted but didn't bolt. When Nate withdrew the needle, he rubbed the spot, whispering thanks. Then came the hooves. Nate knelt beside the front left leg. The hoof had curled into a hook, the outer wall cracked, the frog rotten with damp. He had trimmed plenty in his youth, but never something this far gone. One wrong cut and he could split living tissue. He breathed, set the nippers, and squeezed. The metal bit. Ashes jerked, head tossing. Sarge braced, leaning his shoulder into the horse's barrel, steadying the sway. Nate cut another thin slice, then another, working in small bites. Minutes dragged. Cold numbed his fingers. His back screamed every time he shifted. He paused to stretch, then returned, rasping down the sharp edge, smoothing the wall. Ashes trembled, sweat dampening the coat despite the chill. The hoof began to unfurl. When he set the foot down, Ashes placed it flatter than before, and Nate felt relief rush through him. He moved to the right front. This one was worse. The curl had pinned the pastern at a crooked angle. Nate worked slower, sweat gathering under his collar. He cut, rasped, checked, and cut again. Each squeeze was a battle against steel and pain. Ashes tried to pull away twice. Each time Sarge shifted, pressed, and the horse settled back into the dog's steady weight. Nate couldn't stop noticing that teamwork. It was the same quiet coordination he'd depended on in patrols. By the time the second hoof was trimmed, Nate's arms trembled. He swallowed water, wiped his face, and scooted toward the hind legs. Ash's spine quivered when Nate touched the hock. "Trust me," Nate murmured. He lifted the left hind gently, supporting the fetlock with one hand while he worked the nippers with the other. His back nearly gave out. A wave of dizziness rolled through him. He set the leg down, breathed until the world steadied, then lifted again. Cut by cut, the hoof softened into a usable shape. He rasped the sole, trimmed the jagged wall, and cleaned the infection with antiseptic. When he stepped back, Ashes stood on 3 feet long enough to test the fourth. The final hoof took everything Nate had left. He moved like a man digging a friend out of rubble, careful because the cost of haste was blood. At last, the curl was gone, the edge leveled, the pastern straighter. Nate eased the leg down. Ashes shifted weight, then stood. Not perfectly, not proudly, but flat. For the first time in who knew how long, the Mustang's hooves met the ground the way hooves were meant to. Ashes took one tentative step, then another. He blinked slow, then lowered his head toward Nate's shoulder, breathing warm air into his coat. Nate laughed and cried at once. He leaned against Ash's neck and Sarge sat beside them, tail thumping once on stone. "That's it," Nate whispered. "We're not done, but you're standing, so we keep going." Winter could wait. Today belonged to these 3 souls. The storm warned them hours before the first real wall of snow arrived. Late afternoon in Shadow Creek Valley went still, as if the whole basin had taken one long breath and refused to let it go. The sky bruised to iron gray, the ridgelines vanished behind a thin veil, and a dry hiss of spindrift skated across the ground. Nate Callahan stood outside the root cellar with his collar up and his jaw set, reading the clouds the way he once read battlefield smoke. This felt bigger than the usual valley blow, meaner than any front he remembered from boyhood. Sarge limped to his side, hips stiff from the lion fight, yet his nose stayed high and his ears tracked every shift in air. Ashes waited a few steps back. Muddy bay coat darker now with a little feed in him. Hooves newly trimmed, body still gaunt but no longer collapsing. The Mustang kept glancing toward Box Canyon, nostrils flaring as the smell of snow sharpened. Down the valley, a black SUV crawled along the frozen road, then stopped. Garrett Vance stepped out, took one look at the swelling sky, and climbed back in fast, fleeing toward town. His taillights shrank in the whiteout. Nate watched him go and felt no envy, only a hard clarity. Vance would save himself first, then come back to take what survived. Nate turned from the road and went to work at dawn. Wind came next, sudden and savage. It snapped through the pines, threw needles and ice in Nate's face, and made Ashes toss his head. Nate didn't wait for more signs. Timing mattered more than strength now. He hauled the last armful of hay into the cellar, then pulled a tarp across the doorway. The fabric billowed like a sail. He grabbed a bucket of mud he'd mixed earlier from creek water and dirt and smeared it along every seam where stone met tarp, packing wet grit into cracks so air couldn't knife through the doorway. Snow thickened in minutes, turning the world into a spinning tunnel. Nate hurried the 2 scrawny chickens in first, guiding them with a stick and a murmured, "Come on, now." They clucked and hopped into a straw corner. A gray stray cat appeared out of nowhere, skeletal and wide-eyed, and darted straight for the warm opening. Nate scooped it up, set it beside the hay, and said, "You're in too." The cat blinked, then curled tight without protest. By the time he led Ashes toward the low doorway, visibility had shrunk to a few yards. The roar outside sounded like engines. Ashes balked at the ceiling and the narrow space, but Nate kept his palm on the horse's neck and walked him in slowly. Sarge followed last, then turned to face the entrance as if standing post. Nate ducked inside and sealed the tarps again. The blizzard became a muffled freight train beyond the rock. He lit the lantern and set it high. The cellar smelt of damp earth, hay dust, and animal breath. Nate laid blankets on the floor, checked for leaks, and pressed more mud into any seam that still hissed. Outside, the temperature plunged. He felt it through the stone like teeth. Ashes trembled, flanks fluttering, so Nate pulled off his old army jacket and draped it over the Mustang's shoulders. The sleeves hung too low, but the wool trapped warmth. Ashes lowered his head, accepting it without a fight. Sarge eased down beside the horse's front legs, pressing his body to Ash's barrel. The chickens waddled closer to the dog. The cat crept up to the edge of Nate's blanket, then tucked itself between his boot and his hip. Nate started a small fire in a metal pan, with kindling he'd dried near the lantern. The flame was modest, but in a sealed room, every degree mattered. He poured spring water into a pan so it wouldn't freeze, fed Ashes careful handfuls of oats, and checked Sarge's wrapped hip, rubbing slow circles to keep the joint loose. Dark hit hard. Gusts slammed the hillside above them, shaking dirt loose. Fine snow sifted down the tarps like sand. Nate listened to the pitch of the wind, then forced his mind to the basics: breath, heat, tempo. Warmth was a shared mission now. He pulled everyone close without scaring them. Ash's side radiated steady heat against Nate's shoulder. Sarge's ribs pressed into his shin. Feathers and fur added their small, stubborn warmth to the pile. The cellar turned into a cramped bivouac of survivors. Hours crawled. Nate dozed in short bites, waking whenever the wind changed note. Once the ridge boomed as a tree snapped and fell, and Ashes startled, but Sarge lifted his head and stayed calm, and the horse settled again. Nate kept whispering low truths: "We hold, we breathe, we make morning," until his own heartbeat slowed. Near midnight, his battered thermometer read -35. Even sealed, cold crept along the floor. Nate fed the fire slivers of wood, then pressed closer to Ashes, feeling the Mustang's heart hammer under the jacket. Sarge shivered once, then went still, conserving heat the way old soldiers do. Outside, the freight train roar never let up, but inside, the circle of bodies kept a fragile pocket of life going. Somewhere between pitch black and dawn, Nate woke to silence. At first, he didn't trust it. He waited for the howl to return, but the world stayed quiet. He peeled back a corner of tarp and found a wall of snow packed nearly to the top of the doorway. He dug with his hands, then a shovel, tunneling out until pale light flooded in. The valley outside was a smooth, white ruin. Drifts piled high enough to swallow fence posts and the burnt bones of the ranch. The air was brutal, yet calm. Back inside, he boiled coffee on the little stove and let the smell fill the cellar. He took a slow sip, letting warmth spread into his bones. Ashes stepped into the tunnel, sniffed fresh air, and stood steady on flattened hooves. Sarge followed, limping but proud. The chickens fluttered closer to the opening, and the cat strolled out as if it owned the place. Later that morning, an engine growled up the buried track. Nate heard it before he saw it. Vance's SUV pushed through drifts, Sheriff Holt's truck behind it. They stopped near the ruins, doors opening into cold sunlight. Holt called out, "Are you alive down there?" Nate stepped into view with a coffee cup in his hand, beard rimed with frost, eyes clear. Sarge stood glued to his leg. Ashes walked out behind them, wearing the army jacket like armor. The Mustang lifted his head and blew steam into the sun. Vance stared, stunned. "You should be dead." "Guess the valley miscounted," Nate said calmly. He looked at Sheriff Holt. "This land isn't for sale. Not today, not ever." Holt's gaze moved from the tarped cellar to the horse and back to Nate. "Looks like you found a reason to stay." Nate rested a hand on Sarge's neck, then on Ash's shoulder. "I did," he said, and the words felt like finally coming home. Spring didn't arrive in Shadow Creek Valley like a switch. It came the way healing comes to old wounds, slow, stubborn, and a little painful. A Chinook wind rolled over the ridge in late March, warm enough to soften the drifts, and Nate Callahan stood outside the root cellar with his face lifted to it, like a man relearning a language he'd forgotten. Snow slid off pine boughs in heavy sighs. The creek began to speak again under thinning ice. Every evening the light stayed a little longer. Ashes changed with the season. The Mustang's ribs still showed, but they weren't knives anymore. His coat shed winter dullness, turning to a deeper bay with a brighter sheen along his neck. Nate kept the antibiotics steady, fed him oats and hay, and walked him up and down the canyon floor in careful loops. Each morning, Ashes stood a touch straighter. Each evening he shifted weight without flinching. Sarge, hip-sore but alive, padded beside them, head high, guarding their small herd. One morning in April, Nate woke to meadowlarks. The sound startled him more than the blizzard had. He stepped outside and saw the pasture beyond the ruins turning green in patches where snow had retreated. The air smelt of wet earth instead of frost. He looked toward Box Canyon and found Ashes already there, ears forward, testing the world like a door that had been locked too long. Nate unhooked the lead rope. He didn't say anything dramatic. He just nodded once, the way a commander grants permission without ceremony. Ashes stepped out into the open. For a second he stood still, legs braced, nostrils wide, drinking the valley in. Then he moved, first a cautious trot, then a faster rhythm that lifted dust and thawing grass. His hooves met the ground flat and true. His mane streamed. He broke into a gallop that cut across the pasture like a shout. Nate watched, mouth open, heart thudding. The horse circled once, twice, then raced toward the ridge and back again, free at last, no longer a prisoner of stone or hunger. Sarge sat beside Nate and let out a soft bark, as if saying, "There it is, the reason we fought." The valley noticed, too. A few locals began stopping by on the road, not close, not friendly at first, but curious. An old rancher left a bale of hay by the gate without knocking. The woman from the store brought a sack of feed and said, "Figured you'd need it." Sheriff Holt checked in once a week, always looking at Ashes longer than he looked at Nate, and it wasn't suspicion anymore. It was respect. Garrett Vance didn't return. After the morning, he found Nate alive. He tried to push paperwork through the county, but Holt shut it down in public. The blizzard had taken the shine off Vance's certainty. He turned his attention elsewhere, the way men like him do when they meet something they can't bend. By May, the snow was mostly gone. Nate rebuilt what he could with scavenged lumber and fresh boards hauled on the Ford's last legs. He framed a new shelter over the root cellar entrance, fixed a stretch of fence, and patched the truck's heater enough to hum. On a clear Friday, he drove into town with Sarge on the seat. He walked into Russo's pawn shop, wearing his best flannel and the kind of calm that comes from keeping a promise. Russo looked up and grinned before Nate even spoke. "I told you you'd be back," Russo said, sliding the velvet tray forward. Nate laid the cash down. Every bill earned by sweat and stubborn days. He picked up the Hamilton watch and felt its weight settle into his palm like a salute. When he buckled it onto his wrist, the familiar tick sounded louder than any church bell. Outside, he rubbed Sarge's ears and whispered, "We got it back." The dog thumped his tail. That afternoon, Nate hammered 2 posts into the earth at the ranch entrance and stretched a fresh plank between them. He painted the words in slow, deliberate strokes, letting each letter dry in the sun. Ashes Ranch, a sanctuary for the forgotten. He stepped back, smudged with paint, and laughed at the simple truth of it. He hadn't returned to reclaim a past. He had returned to build a future he could finally stand inside. Early June brought the first visitor who wasn't a local. A dusty pickup rolled down the track and stopped by the new sign. An older man climbed out, hair white under a ball cap, posture careful the way bodies move after years of hard miles. Beside him hopped a black lab with a cloudy eye and a tail that still wagged like a flag. The man stood there a moment, taking in the rebuilt shelter, the pasture, the dog at Nate's side, and the bay Mustang grazing free. Then he called out, "Name's Roy. Heard there's a place here for old soldiers and older dogs." Nate walked forward and offered his hand. "You heard right." Roy's grip was firm, familiar. They didn't trade grand stories. They didn't need to. The silence between them was shared by people who've carried weight in places nobody else saw. Roy looked down at his lab. "This is Daisy," he said. "She's slowing down. Thought maybe we'd find a corner to rest." Sarge limped over and sniffed Daisy gently. The lab wagged harder, then leaned into him. Ashes lifted his head from the grass, walked over without fear, and stood beside the dogs as if he understood introductions mattered. Nate felt something settle in his chest, steady and right. This was what his father meant. Waiting was love. Keeping was love. Making space was love. Roy stayed the night, then a week. They fixed the fence together, drank coffee at dawn, and let the dogs nap in the sun while Ashes ran loops in the pasture like he was rewriting his own ending. When Roy left, he clasped Nate's shoulder and said, "You saved more than a horse, brother." After that, word traveled. Another veteran came through in July with a limping hound. A woman pulled in with a rescue mutt and a hollow kind of grief in her eyes. Nate didn't advertise. He just kept the gate open and the coffee hot. Ashes met each newcomer with a quiet trot and a soft snort, living proof that broken things can return. Nate would sit on the rebuilt porch at dusk, Sarge's head on his boot, Ashes grazing in the gold light, and he'd feel the valley around him not as a judge, but as a companion. He didn't erase the 30 years. He carried them differently. This is the mission now. If this story of a broken soldier, a dying dog, and a horse that refused to quit restored even an ounce of faith in you, hit that subscribe button right now. Because every week we bring you proof that no soul is ever too far gone. And the next one we're dropping? Even more impossible. Turn on notifications. You do not want to miss what's coming.